This meeting is being recorded.
Terrific. Well, thank you everyone for joining us and being a part of this virtual teach-in. And again, right off the bat, do want to thank Chris in my office for doing all the work to help us set this up, as well as say thank you to our panelists who I will allow to introduce themselves in just a moment. But big picture, we are here this evening because the state's DOER will initiate a public hearing process on the Stretch Energy Code. And that process begins tomorrow and will continue for the next week with about 5 public hearings happening around the state and virtually. I believe it's on Thursday morning will be the hearing for those of us here in the Boston area. And as so many of you know, we in the legislature passed the climate roadmap law last session. It was initially vetoed by Governor Baker, but fortunately, we in the legislature didn't back down. We sent the bill back to him. And one of the issues that was a big area of contention is the issue that is before us this evening and that will be discussed in this public hearing process. And that has to do with calling for a stretch energy code that will truly allow our municipalities to limit and even stop new fossil fuel infrastructure in the built environment. And we know that to have any chance of reaching our climate goals of cutting emissions and getting to net zero by 2050, this new fossil fuel infrastructure has to be eliminated. If we're putting new gas appliances into buildings, if we're relying on natural gas to heat hot water, those systems would need to be pulled out of their service before the end of their useful life if we're to have any chance to get to net zero by 2050. So what I'm going to do next is introduce you to our panelists and allow them to introduce themselves. Shall we introduce everyone now briefly? I think maybe we'll do it that way. So why don't I first pass it to my longtime friend and neighbor here in Cambridge, Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan. We're just looking for like a 1-minute intro for each panelist now. So are you there, Quinton?
Thanks, Mike. I'll do the 10-second intro. Quinton Zondervan, Cambridge City Councilor, and happy to be here with you all.
Thank you for that, Quinton. Next, I'd like to introduce Ben Hellerstein from Environment Massachusetts.
Well, thank you so much, Representative, and it's really great to join all of you here today. My name is Ben Hellerstein, and I'm the State Director for Environment Massachusetts. We are a statewide, citizen-supported environmental advocacy organization working to protect clean air, clean water, and open space. And we work on a lot of different issues, but our top priority is getting the state off of fossil fuels and powered with renewables. And certainly tonight's discussion about net zero buildings is a big part of how we envision getting there. So thank you.
And thank you, Ben, and thank you really for supporting us on Beacon Hill. It's always good to be able to turn to you for input and advocacy. And speaking of people who support us in this work, I want to introduce from Mothers Out Front, Sharon Devos.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm on the Cambridge Mothers Out Front team. We are a national group and we also have state and local teams. In Massachusetts, our major focus is on clean heat and clean air, and we are very much engaged in creating a livable climate for all children in the world. And we are pushing for healthy homes and communities. And so this stretch energy code is really critical to us.
Thank you, Sharon. And finally, last but not least, I want to introduce from Nextamp, I believe it's called Melissa Rath, who will be giving us some perspective from the industry side of things as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa. I need a lot more introduction than Quinton, so I'll take not 10 seconds. I am here through Mothers Out Front. I just graduated from Northeastern University last year, and through Mothers Out Front and Sharon, I was able to speak here with you guys. I'm very excited. I currently am a design engineer for Nextamp, which is a Boston-based, but we build nationwide community solar developer. And so I design large-scale solar farms for communities to offtake from when they can't put solar on their homes. I've also worked as an energy engineer for Massachusetts General Hospital and as a systems engineer for Form Energy, which is a long-duration energy storage startup that's at Greentown Labs, an awesome clean tech incubator in Somerville, if you haven't heard of it. And also, I also live in Cambridge. I'm a neighbor to, I'm sure, a lot of you, and I'm excited to start being more a part of the community.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for that full introduction. And proud to say Greentown Labs has been a part of the 26th Middlesex District. So it's just one of the exciting things happening here. And so I'm just going to elaborate on the big picture from the legislative perspective for another minute or two. And then from there, I'm going to pass it to Councilor Zondervan, who will really go through some of the history that we've had right here in Cambridge organizing for net zero. It's a task that we started working on roughly a decade ago. And the idea for this event in part was recognizing how we've come full circle, how, you know, we put that concept of striving for net zero in the built environment out there about a decade ago. The city of Cambridge went ahead with Quinton's leadership and advanced a net zero action plan. Along the way, I was fortunate enough to be elected to represent us on Beacon Hill. Now on Beacon Hill, it's up to us to act to give cities like Cambridge, like Somerville, like Brookline and others, the ability to actually make good on these net zero goals. Because as we will hear from our panelists, the state building code essentially preempts the level of efficiency and renewable energy utilization that really is necessary to have any chance of getting to our climate goals. And, you know, I wanted to do the overall introduction first, just so you could get a sense of who you'll be hearing from. Finally, at the end of the program, and, you know, I'm so excited to see we have nearly 100 people here. And on a Tuesday night to talk about the building code, to have 100 people in the room, I think is absolutely fantastic. I think it really bodes well for our ability to influence this. And so what's exciting about this event is we're not just going to share our experience and our opinions with you. The intent is at the end of this hour-long program, we will provide everyone with templates and with information so that they can make their voice heard in the coming days. I also want to acknowledge we have some elected officials who have joined us. I want to recognize Cambridge City Councilor Patty Nolan, as well as Somerville City Councilor Kristen Strezzo. Our plan is that when we're done with the presentation, any electeds who are here, we will recognize to make a comment if they like, and then we will take any questions. And so that sort of wraps up the general introduction. And I just want to add that there's very exciting news this week that has emerged from Beacon Hill. For anyone who hasn't heard, the House of Representatives on Thursday will be taking up a major piece of offshore wind legislation. And I'm grateful that Speaker Mariano has prioritized offshore wind legislation and has really, you know, stuck a stake into the sand to say that Massachusetts should be the national and the global leader. And of course, we have a long way to go to make that a reality, but it is encouraging. We in the legislature passed significant energy and climate legislation in the 2015-2016 session, in the 2017-2018 session, in the 2019-2020 session, and then Governor Baker vetoed it. We repassed the climate roadmap law at the start of this 2021-2022 session. And now here we are, it's the year 2022, and we are preparing this week to debate another major piece of legislation that would support renewable energy and offshore wind here in the Commonwealth. So it's certainly really exciting. But again, our goals and our ambitions are very much depending on how this stretch energy code is promulgated and rolled out over the remainder of this year. So I'm going to leave it at that as an introduction. I'm so grateful, again, that we have so many folks here and so many experts. And so with that, I'm going to recognize our panelists in the order that we introduced them. So up now is Cambridge City Councilor, and truly my personal go-to champion and expert on climate policy, Quinton Zondervan.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. And glad to be here with you all. I think somebody asked in the chat if we can stop the screen share just so it's easier for people to see each other. There we go.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So I'm going to take you back in time a little bit and then catch you all up to today, because this is a very, very active conversation, as Rep. Connolly said. And so we have developments happening even earlier today. So we'll go back in time about 9 years now, almost a decade before Rep. Connolly and I were elected officials. We were regular citizen activists, and we filed a zoning petition in Cambridge to require newly constructed buildings to be net zero emissions. And back then we were told that, that was an aspirational goal, and, we couldn't really do it yet, but the city did create a task force that became the Getting to Net Zero Action Task Force that was convened. And if I remember correctly, Rep. Connolly couldn't serve on it because he had been elected to the House of Representatives. And so I ended up serving on it because I wasn't elected yet. And we came up with the Net Zero Action Plan that was adopted in 2015 by the Cambridge City Council. And the Net Zero Action Plan is a roadmap that lays out several legislative and other priorities for the city to get to net zero buildings by 2050. And the thing to understand about Cambridge is that, unlike the rest of the state, about 80% of our emissions are from buildings, because our transportation is actually pretty efficient because we're a very small, compact, dense city. And so our emissions are primarily from buildings. So that's why it's really important to address this issue of net zero energy, net zero emissions in our building stock. So fast forward from 2015 until 2020, one of the aspects of the Net Zero Action Plan that we built in from the beginning was a 5-year review process. So the city began the first 5-year review in 2020, and we received the first final report of that process this morning at 11 o'clock in the Health and Environment Committee chaired by Councilor Nolan. And what we concluded in the committee was that, unfortunately, despite all the great work that the staff has done, we're falling behind. The emissions are going up. IPCC reported just yesterday that, globally, we are failing to take sufficient action against climate change. And so what we communicated to the staff today was, we need to step it up. There are so many priorities in the Net Zero Action Plan that have not yet been implemented, including a solar requirement, 100% renewable electricity through our community choice aggregation program, and many others. Now, one of the most important pieces to the Net Zero Action Plan is the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, affectionately known as BWEDO. And BWEDO originally was only requiring buildings to, certain size buildings, large buildings, to report their energy use and emissions. And then if we did not see those emissions going down, then we would start requiring emissions reductions. So that day has now come, and the city has put forward amendments to the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance to require these large buildings to reduce their emissions. So the city council is currently debating those amendments. And again, we're saying, with the support of Mothers Out Front and 350 Mass and many other activists, that we need to go faster, and that 2050 as the net zero target for these, specifically these buildings, which are some of the largest emitters in Cambridge, is too late, and that we need to accelerate that timeline and really get there by 2035 if we're to have any chance of overall getting to net zero as a community by mid-century. So we're currently discussing those amendments. And then in addition to that, I've introduced the Green New Deal for Cambridge, which would require all large new buildings to be net zero from day one, which, as you may recall, is exactly what we asked for 9 years ago and still have not gotten, and still are being blocked at the state level from actually requiring these buildings to be net zero. So just on Friday, we got news from the Attorney General's office that the latest attempt at requiring fossil-free construction in Brookline was not allowed by the Attorney General because of preemption at the state level. And the Net Zero Action Plan for Cambridge requires that starting January 2021, which is already 2 months ago, new small residential, so think single family homes, triple deckers, would have to be constructed net zero. Well, here we are in March 2022, and we're not actually able to implement that requirement because the state has not provided us with a building code that allows us to require fossil-free construction. So the straw proposal that's now before us, unfortunately, still doesn't allow us to require fossil-free construction. And so that's one of the most important things that we all need to be advocating for strenuously, is that the state needs to include in that building code the ability to say buildings that are newly constructed should not have fossil fuel combustion in them. And as I'm sure you'll hear from other panelists, we have all the technology now to do that. And as Rep. Connolly said, we're going to be building offshore wind. We have some of the best offshore wind resources in the world right here off Massachusetts coast. So we are all set to get this done. And all we need now from our state regulators is the ability to implement these regulations. So in Cambridge, we'll be having another hearing in the Health and Environment Committee chaired by Councilor Nolan next week on the BWEDO amendments, the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, and the Green New Deal amendments pertaining to that. So I'll put that in the chat as well, and hopefully folks can participate in that process, and then participate in the state processes as best as you can.
Well, thank you for that, Quinton. So grateful, for your leadership and your friendship and your support here. And, again, to reiterate Quinton's point, and I'm going to be passing it to Ben Hellerstein in a moment, we're really talking about having the state promulgate a stretch energy code that allows our municipalities to preclude the installation of new fossil fuel infrastructure in this new specialized stretch energy code. And by the way, it's not just progressive legislators and city councilors who are saying this. It is actually the committee chairs on Beacon Hill, Senator Barrett, Chair Jeff Roy. They are calling on the Baker administration to fulfill the intent of our climate roadmap law. And so there is broad support for this ambitious action. And so to hear more about it, Ben is working day in and day out to advocate on these issues on Beacon Hill. So I'd like to pass it to Ben Hellerstein of Environment Massachusetts.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Representative, for the introduction, and thanks again for the invitation to join all of you tonight. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. All right, so once again, my name is Ben Hellerstein, and I'm the State Director for Environment Massachusetts. And we're a statewide organization dedicated to protecting clean air, clean water, and open spaces, together with our thousands of citizen members and supporters across Massachusetts. And I'm going to touch on a few things in my remarks over the next 7 or 8 minutes or so. So I'm going to start with just a very quick overview of why is this such a big problem? Why should we care about fossil fuel use and energy use in our buildings? Then I'm going to talk about the solution and what can we do to get our buildings off of fossil fuels. I'm going to focus on the key opportunity that's in front of us today, which is the changes and the updates that are being made to our state's building codes and the opportunity for a net zero code that municipalities can opt into. I'm going to talk about the proposal that the Department of Energy Resources has put out, what's good about it, where is it falling short, and then finally touch on some ways that all of us can make a difference in the process. And I believe later in the presentation, we'll have some more specific instructions as to how folks can weigh in with the Department of Energy Resources. So again, I'll start just by briefly touching on why is this such a big problem? Why is this something that's worth all of us spending our time on? I think we all know that the energy that we use in our buildings today is polluting our air, it is harming our health, and it is changing our climate in dangerous ways. This pie chart here I borrowed from a report from the State Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and it shows where our greenhouse gas emissions come from in Massachusetts. The yellow wedge is electricity generation, which is responsible for about 17% of our emissions in Massachusetts. Most of our electricity, of course, is used in our buildings, right, in our homes and offices and so on. And then the wedge that says commercial buildings, as well as the other wedge that says residential buildings, those are primarily the fossil fuels that we use directly in our buildings, burning them for heating our buildings, for keeping them warm during the winter, for producing hot water, for cooking food. That's a source of another 27% of our emissions. So if you add it up statewide, our buildings are responsible for somewhere around 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. And as Councilor Zondervan said earlier, in some communities like Cambridge, that percentage is actually much higher. So we're never going to be able to meet our climate goals to prevent the worst impacts of global warming without getting our buildings off of fossil fuels. We know that the fossil fuels that we use in our buildings are also a major source of harmful pollution. When we burn oil or gas for heating in our homes or in our businesses, this is pollution that's going directly into the air in our neighborhoods and contributing to unhealthy air quality in the communities where we live. And not only is the air outside of our homes an issue, but also the air inside of our homes can be a threat to our health as well. There has been more and more research in the last couple of years showing a link between bad indoor air quality and negative health outcomes. And that's particularly true for the way that we cook our food. So gas stoves have been shown to be a major source of harmful pollution, again, literally in the places that we live, right? So the sooner we can get our buildings off of fossil fuels, the better it will be for our health, the better for our climate, the better it'll be for all of us. And the good news is that clean, efficient, all-electric buildings are within reach. They are already happening all across the state. Later on, Melissa will touch on some of the specific technologies and components that really are going to make all of this possible. Our homes, our offices, and our schools should be highly energy efficient, right? We should not be using more energy than we need. They should be heated and cooled with clean electric technologies like heat pumps, whether those are air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps. And they should be powered with renewable electricity, ideally wherever possible, generated on site using technologies like rooftop solar panels. So if you put these three ideas together, energy efficient, heated and cooled with clean electricity, and powered with renewable power, that is more or less what people mean when they say net zero building. The exact definition of net zero building varies a little bit depending on who you're talking to. There's sort of different technical standards that have been put out, but that's basically what people mean is efficient, clean electric heating, and no fossil fuels used in the building, and powered with renewable electricity. And when we think about how do we get our buildings to be all of those things, how do we make all of our buildings in Massachusetts net zero buildings, there's really two complementary approaches that we need to be taking in terms of the policy that's happening. The first is for new buildings. So any new buildings that are built from today forward, should be fossil fuel free, highly efficient buildings, right? So we can do that through stronger building codes. We can do that by prohibiting fossil fuel connections in new buildings. We can do that by mandating rooftop solar on new buildings. Those are all options available for new buildings. But we also need to deal with all of our existing buildings. A study that was done in the city of Boston a few years back showed that about 85% of the building square footage that's going to exist in the year 2050 in Boston has already been built. And it's probably a similar figure for Cambridge as well. So we need to have programs in place to get our existing buildings up to snuff as well. So whether that's programs like Mass Save to provide incentives for retrofits, whether that's building energy disclosure requirements and performance standards like the BUDO policy that Councilor Zondervan mentioned earlier, incentives to put up solar panels. Those are all policies that can help us address emissions from our existing buildings. And today we're going to focus on the first item here in number 1 under new buildings, stronger building codes, because we have a big opportunity right now at the state level to really move in the right direction on that particular issue. And that opportunity is that state officials are currently updating Massachusetts building codes. Folks may or may not be familiar with what a building code is. Basically, a building code is what sets the standards for new construction, as well as in some cases major retrofits. So the building codes cover things like fire safety, what kinds of materials can you use in construction, how does the building have to be constructed, all the basics of what should a building look like essentially, right? But it also covers energy efficiency. And in Massachusetts, we start off with something called the base code. That's at the bottom here in the orange color. That is the code that applies for communities that do not take any further action. So that's the kind of baseline base code. Since the passage of a law called the Green Communities Act back in 2008, municipalities, cities, and towns have had the option to opt into something called the stretch code, which sets higher standards
Text
for
messages of
energy.
this young woman.
Sorry, I'm getting some
She's
background noise. I think somebody
a
needs to go on
recent
mute.
graduate of Northeastern.
Hearing this? Okay, great. So the stretch code, that's been a higher standard that cities and towns can choose to opt into. And in fact, it's required for communities participating in a program called Green Communities, which provides grants for local sustainability efforts. Communities that want to participate in that program have been required to adopt the stretch code. And the vast majority of communities in Massachusetts, I think, somewhere close to 299, almost 300 out of 351 cities and towns have opted into the stretch code and have become green communities. over time, the base code has gotten stronger and stronger to the point where it has actually gotten pretty close to the stretch code. So the stretch code hasn't necessarily been much of a stretch, at least at times. And so what has happened is, first of all, that the Department of Energy Resources is in the process of updating the stretch code to make it stronger. But they're also creating something called the specialized stretch code, or the opt-in code. Folks may have heard it referred to the net zero code, which cities and towns can choose to opt into, which is like another step above and beyond the stretch code. This specialized stretch code, or the net zero code, could be a big opportunity for cities and towns to take a step forward towards a more sustainable future. But that's not guaranteed. And unfortunately, that's only going to happen if state officials get it right. And as of right now, there are some signs that the officials at the Department of Energy Resources are on the wrong track, and that they're not making this specialized stretch code as strong as it should be. So just to quickly go over the process here, the DOER released what they're calling a straw proposal, which is like a very rough kind of conceptual first draft of what this code is going to look like back in February. As the representative mentioned earlier, in March, there are going to be public hearings and the opportunities to submit comments up until March 9th, written comments. Later this spring, DOER will flesh out the straw proposal into a full draft of the code. In the summer, they'll accept comments on the draft code. And then sometime in the fall, they're planning to publish the final code. And December is the deadline for them to promulgate the code under the requirements of the 2021 climate law. Doesn't necessarily mean it's guaranteed that they're going to do it on that timeline. Certainly a lot of legislative timelines have passed by previously without action. And so it's important for all of us to stay on top of them so that that does actually happen on schedule. And just to very quickly highlight, some of the things that are good in the proposal, as well as some of the things that really need some more work. DOER would, under this specialized stretch code, would require stronger energy efficiency standards for new buildings, better air sealing, more efficient ventilation, more efficient windows. All these can lead to cost savings for residents. So it's good, not just for the environment, but for people's pocketbooks as well. And it also requires large multifamily buildings to meet what are called passive house standards, which is basically just a very high standard for the efficiency of the building envelopes. So, it's like the walls and the windows and the roof, et cetera, have to be very tightly sealed so that they're not letting heat either, in or out. So that makes the building much more energy efficient. So those things are good. Those are certainly steps in the right direction. But where it really doesn't go far enough is that it does not actually prohibit fossil fuel heating and appliances in new buildings. So a city or town like Cambridge could adopt this specialized stretch code, but you could still see new buildings that are being built with fossil fuels. And DOER says, well, we're setting certain standards for efficiency, and really it's going to be more cost effective for developers to build with heat pumps instead of gas heating. But the reality is that's really not a guarantee, right? We know that there have been literally decades, if not centuries, of construction that has relied on fossil fuels. And unless we have a clear mandate in place, I think in a lot of cases we're just going to revert to the status quo, which is it's just easier to do gas or oil in buildings because that's what people have been doing for again for decades, right? So we need that strong requirement in place for fossil fuel free, and that is not currently in this proposal. It also would not actually require rooftop solar on all suitable buildings. So there could be a lot of buildings put up that would have a perfect roof for solar panels, but it wouldn't actually be required under this code. So bottom line, it doesn't go far enough. When we think about this specialized stretch code, when we think about a net zero code, net zero really has to mean fossil fuel free, right? There's just no other way about it. We need to make sure DOER has fossil fuel free requirements in this code. So what you can do, first of all, I would encourage everybody to submit comments to DOER, and we'll hear more a little bit later on about how exactly you can do that. Second, I encourage everybody also to look into legislation at the State House that will help to move us even further in the right direction, right? So this specialized stretch code is one big opportunity to move towards more efficient fossil fuel-free buildings. But there's a lot more work to be done, particularly on the side of existing buildings. And so I've just listed a few specific bills here. I encourage folks to check these out. Many of them are still pending before various committees in the legislature. And so your voices can also make a big difference on these pieces of legislation. So with that, I will wrap up. Thanks so much. And happy to take questions either at the end, or if folks want to reach out separately, happy to chat more as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ben. That was so incredibly helpful. And I'm going to keep moving right along to our next panelist, and then there will be time for questions at the end. So next, I want to introduce, once again, Sharon Devos from Mothers Out Front here in Cambridge. And hopefully Sharon's with us.
Hi, Mike, I am with you, but Melissa is following Ben, and then I will go.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for pointing that out. So let's hear from Melissa from Mothers Out Front and from Nextamp.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks, Mike. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Make sure nothing embarrassing pops up. Okay, good. Does that look like a slideshow? Awesome.
It does.
Okay, so I just started with this slide because I think it's hilarious that they just made Boston green, but also think it looks kind of inspiring, Emerald City like. And I already did my quick introduction, but in a more general sense, I've been a student for the past, 22 years of my life. And I'm just now reaching out and becoming a part of the Boston/Cambridge community. And it feels really great to be here with you all and not just working within a college campus and with the actual community that I live in. And so I'm here to kind of dive into some of the more technical aspects of what a net zero building policy would look like, especially day to day in your own homes, how we can get this. Wow. Sorry, guys, I'm very nervous. There's more people in this meeting than I have seen in the past 3 months. But I'm just gonna dive in. So I already went over the different jobs that I have had, but I wanna give 2 anecdotes to kind of give you an example of my background and also to shed some light on what these policies will mean for different industries in Boston. The first is Nextamp, which is the orange arrow on the right. And that is a community solar company that I currently work for. And the reason why I want to specify that it's a community solar company is because one of the reasons why fixing this stretch code is so important and mandating solar on rooftops here in the greater Boston area is because very, very few residents of Metro Boston actually can have access to the community solar farms that we've been building around the entirety of New England, because we're just not in close enough proximity in the utility region that allows you to offtake. So the majority of the residents of Massachusetts don't actually get to offtake from these amazing community solar farms that we've been building. And having the electricity be able to be generated right at the source where most of us are consuming it is super important, both from a technical perspective. You have a lot less energy losses when you're generating electricity right where you're going to be using it. And also from a land perspective, so much of the land that we're building solar on is agricultural land. It could be used for farms, it could be used for communities. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it's a great way to use land. But if instead of putting solar panels on land that could be used for something else and putting them on buildings that are already making the land underneath them unusable, it's a super important aspect to push for in this code. And the second anecdote that I want to give is the most relevant experience to building codes that I have had was working as an energy engineer for Massachusetts General Hospital, which I don't know if it's like super public or not, but they are really the leaders in decarbonizing the medical industry. It's incredibly impressive, the structures that they have within their staff and within their buildings. So I worked on a team that was entirely dedicated to decreasing our carbon emissions. There were 3 of us. We were all facilities engineers, and Massachusetts General Hospital has decreased their carbon emissions from around 2010-ish, 40%. They are one of the only hospitals in the Northeast region and probably most of the country to be able to achieve that. And it does not come easy. The reason I'm going to explain like a few of the strategies that they have done to decarbonize is to show you how difficult it is once a building is already built to make it energy efficient, to electrify, and to decarbonize. And that is such an important part of this code is Boston buildings are getting very old, and there's a lot of new construction happening all the time. And I don't know the exact percentage, but so much of the energy efficiency and electrification capabilities are determined at construction. Post-construction, it takes so much more money, so much more effort. And in hospitals, I mean, so many of the buildings in the city are medical or some sort of other research laboratory that need to be running 24/7. And almost all of the retrofitting additions that need to be made to these buildings to make them more energy efficient and decarbonize them, you have to have downtime. And that's just another barrier that makes it so much more difficult. So one of the biggest projects that MGH ever took on was to create a steam pipeline from a steam plant over here in Cambridge under the river over to MGH. And that's their like own personal steam line to heat all their entire campus over there. And that kind of infrastructure is something that does not come cheap, that does not come easy, and is harder and harder to get done. And that was just one example to show that the answer isn't always pure electric heat in a building. There are other options. And if these buildings are pushing back for different reasons, it's important to know that there's lots of things that can be done. Anyways, the other things that I want to talk about are one more thing, just to really reiterate how difficult it is to retrofit and fix these buildings once they've been built. Pretty much my entire job while I was working at MGH was to fix all of the like alarms that were going off based on when the heating and cooling systems in the building were way overusing. And that would happen because things would break, because there were leaks, because somebody that was working on it left a door open. And our entire job was to just like mitigate carbon emergencies in the hospital. And that's what happens when you don't think about these things ahead of time. It takes so much just to keep it under control if you don't design them properly in the beginning. Okay, now I'm going to quickly explain the two prominent parts of this. I think everybody knows what solar is and general like renewable energy integration, so I'm not going to dive too much into that. But I think that there are a lot of nuances to what energy efficiency and electrification in buildings means. And I think that for you guys to actually understand, especially in these large buildings in the city, what that takes is important to understand how important this code is. Okay, so heating and cooling, we've been over that. Specifically heating up here in the north is a massive energy consumption. And right now, most of it in the city is purely fossil fuels. We get gas and oil distributed directly into our buildings. As Ben mentioned, it's super unsafe. It's polluting the air, and it's also contributing to climate change. The three things really bad. And when I was thinking about this, thinking of the idea of an entirely electrified building, that means that like you don't have to have carbon monoxide alarms. You still need smoke alarms, but like much less of a risk. And the idea that you don't have to stress about what's going to be in your air because we're not putting pollutants into our air was just such a freeing idea. Okay, but so when it comes to big buildings, controls are the name of the game when it comes to energy efficiency. You want to understand what is going into your building, what is coming out of it, and if it's doing what you want it to. So not only do you have to design your buildings for minimal energy consumption, you also have to watch them and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. And that's a really, really important aspect of the building reporting thing. I don't remember what it's called. So basically, mandating that these buildings are reporting means that we're actually keeping them to the promises that they're holding, because if you don't upkeep these buildings, if you don't make sure you know what's going on in them, all of those design efforts in the beginning can totally fall apart. So one of the reasons why energy efficiency is so important at the onset of construction is because so much of it is what we call the building envelope. And that is basically how good your building is at retaining heat or expelling heat in the summertime. Up here, it's much more important about retaining heat. And we do that with triple pane windows. We do that with specialized insulation. We do that with building design. One of my absolute favorite passive house designs is utilizing windows and window shades for times of the year. So in the summertime, the sun is higher in the sky. So if you have an awning over your window, it will shade it. And in the wintertime, since the sun is lower in the sky, it's below the awning, the sun will come in. And that's just literally like a singular piece of wood that you can put on the outside of your window to totally change how your building is retaining and expelling heat. I'm not going to go through all of this because I've already probably talked too much. But basically, these are all of the most important parts of large building energy efficiency. And then this is just to show you all the examples of what electrification means. We talk about electric heat, but what that really entails is also good circulation in your home. I'm sure we all have hot spots and cold spots in our buildings, and there are ways to design layouts and design airflow systems that doesn't happen. I didn't even know about all these technologies. Heat pumps are a super big buzzword over the past 5 years, and they're this really, really incredible technology that honestly is kind of hard to explain, but basically they are way more efficient than a regular electric heater. And we can apply them to water heaters, we can apply them to space heaters, and we can apply them to our dryers. I didn't even know that, that's so cool. So basically, there are a lot of amazing new technologies that are getting highly, highly efficient and run off of electricity. And so that's basically what this slide is, nothing too much. But lastly, I wanted to take the opportunity to pull this pie chart, which is Massachusetts electricity mix. So basically, very, very important that we electrify. But what's just as important is that electricity that we're bringing into our buildings is renewable energy. And that is where batteries come in, where solar comes in, where our offshore wind farms are coming in. Because the way that electricity generation works is there are a lot of losses. And so if we are bringing in electric heat from a natural gas plant, it's honestly much more efficient and less carbon polluting, not less polluting in your home, but less carbon polluting to just burn that natural gas in your home rather than have a natural gas plant that's generating electricity, bring it all the way to your home, and then heat your food with electricity. So in summary, the more we electrify, the more pressure it's going to put on our electric grid system that is already pushing back against renewables and using the increased demand as a reason for us not to be integrated into the system. Batteries are going to be a huge component of allowing the grid to be more stable for both our increased demand as we continue to electrify and the variable generation that comes from renewable energy. So I'm sure some of the codes and things that Ben had put on his slide had to do with increasing our renewable mix, but I just wanted to reiterate that while Massachusetts is doing much better than the majority of the country, we still have a long ways to go to make our electricity actually clean. And that is everything. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Melissa. I really appreciated all of that, particularly hearing about some of your experiences working for Mass General and how we're actually producing, I guess, heat for them here in Cambridge and sending it over there under the river, and just wholeheartedly support everything you've said. And so now we said we would keep this to an hour, so we're now we're at our final speaker here, and that is Sharon Devos from Mothers Out Front right here in Cambridge. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you to everybody who has spoken. And I want to thank you in the audience for coming out tonight to learn and to take action. Because as you have heard, the stretch code has some good things in it, but it doesn't go far enough. And we need the Department of Energy Resources to hear from you that we as Massachusetts residents want to protect our health, our communities, and our environment. And the allowance of fossil fuels in newly constructed buildings will mean that we, as residents and also the owners of new constructed buildings, are going to bear the costs down the line for retrofitting buildings that should be built fossil fuel free right now. And we are going to have to deal with the health consequences right now. So we need the Department of Energy Resources to adhere to the mandate in the Next Generation Roadmap bill that was signed into law because of all the work that we as citizens did. We spoke to our legislators, they heard us, the governor didn't hear us, and the legislators went back again because the governor knew he really had to do this. So thank you for all of that energy that you put in. And I know some of you know that your voices matter, but when we're up against a crisis that we are in, this climate crisis, we can feel like, what can we do? I only have one voice. But we have learned at Mothers Out Front, and a lot of other organizations have found out too, that our voices really do matter when we come together. And especially when we are educated, as we had a chance to be tonight, to really know what the issues are. We have found that, you know, legislators and other public officials are dealing with so many issues that sometimes they really don't have the time to know the facts. They also don't always know what their constituents really care about. And that's why, you know, we have the fossil fuel lobbyists are making sure, you know, their thoughts are heard. So it's so important that we come together as individuals, but we come together with a fairly unified message that this is not enough. There's urgency. We can't afford to wait any further. And it's not just about us. It is about, we have a lot of disenfranchised people who have been bearing the cost more than some of us. And that is true around the world. Massachusetts is relatively privileged. So as Ben Hellerstein pointed out too, reaching out to your legislators is really important. Let them know how much you care, and that you vote and you're not going away, and the urgency is just beyond. We just can't wait any further. So Chris has a template he has prepared. So you can use that template to reach out tonight to the Department of Energy Resources. And I strongly suggest that you send a message to your local and your state officials to let them know that you send a message to the DOER and that you care very much. So thank you so much for coming and being part of this tonight.
Thank you so much for that, Sharon. Wholeheartedly echo everything that you had to say, and so grateful for all of your work over the years. To reiterate what Sharon said, Chris Addis in my office has just put into the chat our template that we have provided to suggest to folks, if you're not sure where to begin drafting your own comment, you can use this template and submit a comment. I'm also putting into the chat here the hearing page that has the schedule and the different dates and times, as well as the online email comment option. So hopefully we've been talking at you for close to an hour. So hopefully people have all of the basics they need. We've had close to 100 people here. So if you think about that, if we have 100 comments coming in this week, I think that will absolutely be noticed. So before we conclude, we're going to just do two things. I'm going to invite the other two elected officials who joined us to say a brief hello, and we're already over time, so if you can keep it brief, that would be great. Then we will open it up to see if there are any questions, and we're already over, so I'm hoping we can wrap this all up within 10 minutes or so people can hopefully get a bite to eat and then watch the State of the Union if you're a political junkie like myself. So if Councilor Patty Nolan is here, love to have her say hello. Hi, Patty.
Hello, Mike and everybody. I will be brief. However, reiterate ditto everything that everybody said, but most importantly, we need to recognize that without these new buildings, all new buildings being net zero, I've run numbers, any of us who are number geeks, there is no way to meet the requirements of the climate roadmap bill without a minimum of new buildings being fossil fuel free. Never mind, as Ben and others have talked about, that existing buildings, and Melissa talked about the challenge of existing buildings. You look outside, when you go outside next, every single building you see has to have no fossil fuels within a relatively short period of time, 20 years, but that means all new buildings. Mike, any of your reps, we desperately need you, as Quinton said, to pass something that allows us to have net zero, true net zero buildings. But more importantly, I actually think, I don't understand why, if we're such a leader as Massachusetts, that we're not requiring every single new building to be net zero, to be fossil fuel free, just new buildings. They can do it, it's easier, it doesn't even cost more money, and operationally they can save more money in the long run. So we cannot reach the goals without this. We desperately need this to happen. But boy, I'd even up it and say we should have the state not pass an opt-in code, but more like every single new building should meet fossil fuel free, and then we can talk about how it is that we retrofit everybody. So we so need it. As Quinton said, he and I were on a meeting this morning trying to get Cambridge to do it. Cambridge hasn't even stepped up yet. So that's it. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Patty, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, and absolutely appreciate that perspective. Fortunately, you know, the chairs of the TUE committee have gone out and said, look, if this code does not come back to fit our intent and the demands of the moment, then we're preparing legislative alternatives. So hopefully combined, we will all make the right impact. And so next,
just as you know, with the super majority of the Democrats, if Massachusetts can't do it, who can?
Absolutely. No, we have to lead. So thank you so much, Councilor. And finally, want to introduce, if she's still here, Councilor Strezzo, to say a quick hello. and there's a lot of Zoom meetings happening, so if not, are there any questions?
We see John Borger has raised his hand. John Borger.
Hi, John Borger from Hingham, Massachusetts. I didn't get what I wanted to get out of tonight's session, and I thought I should share that with you. This is actually a pretty complicated sort of simultaneous equation with thousands of moving parts for the DOER to figure out. The reason I say that is that we could have the perverse outcome in some towns that insisted on no fossil fuels for new buildings immediately. We could have the perverse outcome that a significant portion of those buildings reflects the grid that they have, which may mean that a significant portion of the electricity that they're burning seems like it's net zero, but it's really could be coal-fired. There's a term called net zero ready that I think we need to be aware of. And what I cannot determine from where I sit, because the whole process with the DOER and lobbyists with the governor are, it's opaque to us. But there's, if you read the DOER slides, they appear to have put a lot of analysis into this. And they appear to be trying to orchestrate a gradual phase approach to enforcing absolute net zero standards. And for those towns, for instance, I'll use my town as an example. Hingham has its own municipal light plant. We are currently at 50% carbon-free sourcing. 50%. Okay? That means the other 50% involves carbon emissions. So we're trying for net zero ready with the understanding that it's going to be some time, and it's going to take another potentially 10 or 15 years where we get the grid to be 100% net zero. And so we're faced with this difficult problem where not one size fits all. And for some towns, it may be actually a better contribution to combating climate change to allow a reasonable phase in, reasonable use of natural gas, pending getting the grid to the point where it is absolutely 100% carbon free. I didn't hear a lot of subtlety or nuance tonight in relative to these concerns. The real concerns, and the DOER is obviously grappling with those concerns, and we need to grapple with those concerns. It's very difficult, but one size does not fit all, and I'd invite comment on that.
Sure, no, I certainly can appreciate that perspective. I do think that a lot of what we're doing here is building toward that vision of 2050 and recognizing that to the extent we install, new fossil fuel infrastructure on the building level today, we will need to pull that infrastructure out if we have any chance of getting to our goals. I know Quinton added some points in the chat, so I'm going to give him a chance to offer some perspective as well, but I appreciate the question and the remarks. Quinton?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, John, for that comment. There's two things. One, we need lots of local renewable energy, solar and wind. And two, we're talking about an opt-in code. So, cities and towns will go as fast as they can, but we're certainly not proposing to impose anything on other municipalities. And, just for context, I'm in the living room of my net zero emissions home right here in Cambridge. And we are running about 66% over the period of 1 year on solar panels in this house. So that's how we get there, right? We can't switch 100% to the grid and then say, oh, we're net zero, because as being pointed out, the grid still has a lot of fossil fuels. So we have to generate a lot of that electricity locally as well and build that up as we shift towards electrification.
Thank you
I
for
would
that.
just quickly, oh, sorry, Representative.
Well, I was going to see if Ben wanted to add a word too.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things. So first is that DOER has actually looked at this question, of what does it mean to have a building go all electric today? What are the impacts on emissions, given that a significant amount of our electricity is coming from fossil fuels? And what they found is that heat pumps are so much more efficient than oil or gas heating that the emissions are actually lower today, switching to heat pumps, even with some of our electricity still coming from fossil fuels, than they would be if you were heating your home with an oil or gas boiler. So going electric today, again, even with some of the electricity coming from fossil fuels, reduces the emissions associated with heating by 64% for each unit of heat that you're providing. And over time, as our electric grid becomes cleaner and cleaner, that will go to virtually 100%. So that's, I think it's important to understand that today there are very real emission savings that come from going electric, even with some of our electricity still coming ultimately from fossil fuels. And number two is I think it just points to, I think as others have said, just the need to rapidly scale up technologies like wind and solar, which are available to us. We have the technologies, we have the resources, and it's just a question of how quickly can we have the policies in place and the investments in place to make that happen. But no matter which way you slice it, it just doesn't really make sense today to build buildings that have fossil fuel infrastructure in them.
Well, I really appreciate all of that. Thank you for the question, John. Thank you, Quinton and Ben. We're going to go to Cynthia next. And then earlier I saw Susan had raised her hand. So if you still have your question, Susan, we'll go to you after that. But Cynthia Hibbard.
Thank you, Representative, and thanks to all the speakers. This has been great. Ben, this is a quick question for you. You said that the current straw proposal from the DOER for the net zero stretch code still allows fossil fuel heating, cooling, cooking. If that goes through and becomes final, will we have a situation where towns will still be prohibited from requiring no fossil fuel connections? In other words, if fossil fuel connections are allowed, will Brookline and Cambridge and other towns who want to have no fossil fuel hookups be prohibited from doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the case. Yeah, so the problem
wow.
that communities like Brookline and Cambridge are facing today is that, as folks may have heard, I think it was mentioned earlier, Brookline, where I live, a couple of years ago, we passed a local bylaw to prohibit gas connections in new construction. The Attorney General reviewed that and determined that that was not permitted by state law, that the town did not have the authority to do that. Brookline went forward with another proposal that was a little bit different, but sort of got at that same goal. And we were told again by the Attorney General that that was not allowed. So essentially where we are is that cities and towns like Brookline and Cambridge are very limited in terms of what they can do to regulate gas or oil in new construction. And so we're really dependent on the state providing this opt-in option. And so if it turns out that this opt-in code is not very strong, if it still allows for fossil fuels to be used in new construction, then we very well could be in a situation where Brookline and Cambridge and other similar communities just aren't able to go further because we just don't have that authority.
Thank you for that, Ben. I see Susan has her hand raised.
Yes, well, I joined something called the Queensy Climate Action Network, after being leafleted in the Common in Boston. I've been a longtime member of the Sierra Club, though not an organizer, and I've been interested in NRDC and stuff like that, but I'm in a panic. I personally went and bought 100% wind from Green Energy Consumer Alliance. And I'm waiting to find out the report from the study that was put up about green municipal aggregation. Is that well, I wasn't going to ask that, but one question is, does what Ben just talked about cancel green community aggregation? And another is, I go to a church in the South End, in the Back Bay, and their electric grid is too old and small to handle solar panels on the roof. And they don't have room for a battery that is big. And they've seemed to have given up on doing anything. Their electricity by default is going to be green, but their heat is steam from vicinity energy that doesn't want to go renewable until 2050, by which time Boston will be underwater. What can they do about the fact that vicinity is making that steam with gas? All right, is that 2.5 questions? I'm sorry. I have a million questions, but.
Sure. Well, certainly, first and foremost, yeah, appreciate your activism, appreciate you being here. My sense is in the community aggregation, that is about sort of the content of the electricity that is distributed throughout the town. So that's, probably, I would think, a separate issue than the building code standards for new construction. I'm going to pass it to our expert, Ben, if Ben, you care to comment at all as well.
That's right. Yeah. So municipal aggregation is authorized under a different section of state law, so that will still be allowed. That's not going to be affected by DOER's decision on the building codes one way or the other. On the steam issue that you brought up, that is a big challenge in sort of downtown Boston and surrounding areas, as well as the Longwood area is another part of Boston that has a district steam system. And I know that there have been some studies that have been done looking at how those systems can be transitioned to renewable energy. I don't know exactly what the status of that is, but I know that particularly in Boston, that has been an area where the city administration has been paying some attention.
Thank you for that, Ben. And keep in touch, Susan. I'm sure we would be happy to continue the conversation and address any other questions. So we're now going on 18 minutes over. So if anyone here has a burning question about these regulations, let us know now. Otherwise, I'm going to start to wrap this up. Chris, if you would maybe put in the chat one more time the template for people to reach out and make those comments. All right, I see Downing has his hand raised. This is the last question. I'm calling it here. Downing.
This is just a comment, and want to thank everyone and thank you particularly, Rep. Connolly, for organizing this. But I also wanted to credit Dave Buck in 350 Massachusetts. About a third, or at least a third of the people on this tonight were 350 Mass activists. Dave went the distance, got it in our statewide newsletter. Our node suspended its meeting to be here. So just want to give a shout out and thanks for that.
Wow, well, that is an apt way to conclude this. Yes, thank you for highlighting Dave, and really thank you to 350 Mass. Thank you to Ben and Environment Massachusetts. Thank you to Melissa from Nextamp. Thank you to Chris Addis in my office, as well as Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan. I'm so grateful we all took this time to really dig into this. I feel like I learned a few things, and really looking forward to submitting our comments this week, and then either directly through the administrative process, or if we have to come back on the legislative end one way or another, let's all keep working together to get to this goal of net zero emissions. So I'm going to call it there. Thank you so much, and good night to everyone.